Hi there. I'm wearing my Library Lynn hat today to catch you up on the latest chapter of How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. It's been a good long time since I've made a video for this series, so here's a quick recap of what we've covered so far. There are 4 stages to reading: elementary, inspectional, analytical, and syntopical. So far, we've discussed the first 3 stages. You have to work on each stage of reading and master each one before you move on to the next. First, then second, and so on down the line. I have videos on the first 3 stages in a playlist below. The bulk of the book and most of the videos are devoted to stage 3, analytical reading. You can apply their principles to short works like articles or to full-length books. And I'll just stop here to say, their book is for serious reading. It's for difficult books. You don't have to go through any of these, well, you have to go through elementary reading, but you don't have to go through inspectional or analytical reading to get something out of a book. This is just for difficult books. Now, when I was a college student, I was required to apply analytical reading to my assignments. That's basically why you use analytical reading, is if you want to learn something. Unfortunately, I had never been formally trained to do this, so my attempts weren't always successful. The author suggests, and I do think it would be helpful, if training in reading up through the analytical stages was required for all students before they graduate from high school. It's a basic skill that would benefit anybody. And for all I know, it may be in some places at this point, but I'm not sure about that. If you really want to get to the nitty-gritty on this, I urge you to buy the book for yourself and use it as a reference. But now that we've finished the painstaking work of working our way through the instructions for analytical reading, we're going to move on to apply their advice to different kinds of books, and we'll end the series with a discussion of Stage 4, syntopical reading. For syntopical reading, we'll learn the ways to apply multiple books on one topic and compare, contrast, and synthesize the information within them. But today's video covers the bridge between analytical reading and the rest of the types of the books, and that is aids to reading. Now, this book was written in 1972. That's 52 years ago at this point, and many of you, maybe most of you, weren't even alive then. At the time, we had computers, but I don't think they were yet connected in any meaningful way. There may have been communications between computers for large industries or for academic computers, but they weren't available to the average reader, that's for sure. Because of these massive changes in information technology, the information they give here is dated in a lot of ways, but some of it still applies, and that's what I'm going to talk about the most today. I'm going to skip the parts that really don't apply to our information ecosystem now. Since my focus on this series is on the book itself, I'm going to highlight what they recommend with just a few comments on how they might alter their advice if they were alive today to do it. So let's dive in, shall we? So far in the book, they've urged us to do intrinsic reading, meaning that we stick to the book we're reading with no external helps. Any external source constitutes extrinsic reading, the subject of this chapter. The reason that they've urged us to eschew external forces so far is that the point of their discussion is to help us assimilate and understand, to learn the material in a given book, and to make it our own. They say that until we've worked through the analytical stage in a book on our own, we can actually interfere with the learning process if we turn to other sources. Ideally, we should only turn to these sources once we've done the hard work of grappling with the author on our own. Now, I've always been a big reader, and throughout life, I've had several people tell me, one of whom seemed to actually be sneering it, I don't want to read about life. I want to experience life. Has anyone ever said that to you? They just don't get it, do they? That's pretty much what Adler and Van Doren are saying here about reading. By bringing in external sources to help with a great book, you're experiencing it secondhand rather than in an immediate and intimate way. But once you've done this work, you've worked through it analytically, you have their permission to delve into extra material to your heart's content. Hooray! So there are 4 sources of external reading material discussed in this book. Number 1, the reader's prior experiences. Number 2, other books. Number 3, commentaries and abstracts. And number 4, reference sources. Naturally, we would like to add the internet and possibly videos, even though videos aren't reading, but they are readily available enhancements to understanding that weren't so freely available back in the day. So let's take a look at each of these sources that they cover in turn. First, your relevant experiences. You bring whatever life experiences or prior classes or reading to anything you encounter for the first time. Because of this, everyone reading a book will experience it differently depending on the filters their past experiences has them seeing through. They say there are 2 kinds of past experience, common and special. They spend a lot of time differentiating between the 2, but it's really simple. Common experience has been experienced by many, if not most people. Not every person. That would be universal experience, and they say universal experience really doesn't exist. But common experiences are experienced by most people. Most people have slept in a bed at some point in their life, that sort of thing. All right, the second is special experience, and that's been experienced by only a select few. Very few people have traveled to the moon and walked on it. Very few people have actually split an atom. They go on quite a bit about how each of these kinds of experiences can be helpful in different types of reading. I'm not going to cover their discussion because I don't think it matters, and a lot of it to me seem like common sense. You've either experienced something or you haven't, and no one needs to tell you to apply your experience to what you read. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure why they even listed this separately, because you should have been applying your prior experiences during your analytical reading process, and you probably did without being told to do it. But in discussing experience, they do add the test that they gave earlier on understanding a book here. That is, once you've read it, can you give an example of what the author is talking about by providing an example from your own experience or understanding? If you can, you understand what the author is saying. And if you can't, you need to revisit what they said until you do. So moving on. Next type of external source is other books. Some books can be read in isolation. You don't need to read a history of the Regency era to understand a Jane Austen novel, for example. But some books, it absolutely does matter. You need to read other books before you read a book in a certain order. Here's an example they give, and I've experienced it myself. The Federalist Papers. Now, I read a big chunk of the Federalist Papers for a class I took a while back. It really was difficult to understand. They say it's a huge mistake to read this collection of letters written by the Founding Fathers before you read the entire Constitution of the United States and the Articles of Confederation. This makes a lot of sense. Both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution are referenced in the letters over and over. They're what the letters are based on. So if you don't understand what they're referring to, you're not going to understand what they're saying. Before you pick up a work, you may want to do a little background reading to see if it's based on something else that you need to read first. And if there is, then of course read that first. They say this is particularly true in philosophy because philosophers tend to base their work on the work of other philosophers before they came along. So you may, for example, want to read Plato before you read Aristotle. Okay, moving on to number 3, commentaries and abstracts. Commentaries are works that critique or analyze a work. Literary criticism is one example. Many introductions to books are written by commentators. And even though they urge you to read the introductions in the chapters on inspectional reading, they qualify that here by saying you should only read an introduction that is written by the author. If anyone else writes it, it will skew the way you view the work. All immediacy is lost. They don't use this as an example, but I suppose it's sort of like wearing a glove to clean. You don't get the unimmediated experience. You can't tactily tell if what you're cleaning is getting clean or not. It's sort of like that with this. They point out that commentators can often get things wrong. And even if they're right, they don't cover everything you can and should get from the book on your own. It's tempting to read commentaries and feel like you understand the whole book and all its nuances when you don't. So they say read these commentaries after you have read the work thoroughly yourself and have a good grasp on it. They also say this is true of handbooks. They say never read a handbook before you read the work itself. I have one here. It's the Shakespeare Handbook by Levi Fox. Here's an article on the Blackfriars Theater. They cover things about every play that may be helpful for you when you read it. That's a handbook. But they believe that if you read a handbook first, it will cause your brain to atrophy. It's sort of like watching someone else work out while you sit on the couch. If you don't do the work yourself, you're not really gaining anything. Now, an abstract is just a short summary of the book. They only allow 2 legitimate uses for these before you've read the book. First, if you need to jog your memory about something you haven't read in a while, use an abstract. And second, if you're embarking on a project of syntopical reading, remember that's where you combine several different books to get a more thorough grasp of a subject, and you want to know if a book you haven't read yet would be useful to include in your project, read the summary, read the abstract. In that case, it's fine because it'll save you time in the long run. Okay, so now we move on and get to my favorite. Number 4, reference books. There are lots of kinds of reference books. They concentrate on 2 of them in this discussion. They point out that what they have to say about these 2 references apply to other reference books as well. And the 2 that they cover are dictionaries and encyclopedias. When I did my video on their discussion of inspectional reading, I dutifully reported their advice not to consult a dictionary the first time you read through a book. And a few viewers gently objected to this advice. They talk about it again here. Their point was not that a dictionary should never be used when reading a book. They just wanted to help readers feel permission to read a book and get the gist of what the author is trying to say before they look words up. To stop and look things up on the first go-round interrupts the flow of the author's discourse and makes the big picture, the whole thing, more difficult to grasp. They make an exception for technical words that are used over and over again, though. If a word seems to be a crucial part of their arguments and you don't know what that word means, look it up right away. But for words that are used less often, don't bother. Try to use context clues to figure out the meaning, and if that doesn't work, then mark those words to look up once you've worked through the book the first time. Now, because they're writing in a time when there was no internet, when people didn't carry around humanity's collected knowledge in their back pockets, they spend a lot of time talking about how crucial it is to read a reference work's introduction and the best ways to use the sources. They cover the history of dictionaries and encyclopedias as well, and I'm not going to get into that because we don't use those sources the same way we used to. Instead, I'm just going to cover a few of their pointers. Back before the internet, people kept dictionaries around to know the correct spelling and pronunciation of words. That seemed to be the biggest reason I looked up words in dictionaries, spelling and pronunciation. And as an aside, to be completely honest, I never really understood the pronunciation symbols. In these somewhat happier days of automatic spell checkers and online dictionaries where you hear the words being pronounced, that's no longer their primary use. They say you should be examining words based on the nuances of meaning, the parts of speech, and the etymologies or the word's histories. And I say that definitely still holds. That's the way I use dictionaries most today. As a writer, it's important to me to get the meanings and shades of meanings that I used in words absolutely correct. And this often depends on the part of speech, on whether the word is used as a verb or an adjective, for example. Like in the word fly, that can refer to an insect. It can be the act of riding in an airplane. It can mean flapping your wings and soaring, or it can mean to run very fast. That's just a basic example, but most words are rich with possibilities. As a reader, you want to use a dictionary to help you further understand how a particular word is used by the author. It matters a great deal in fields like philosophy and science. Now on to encyclopedias. Our primary author, Mortimer J. Adler, was the chairman of the U.S. edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica's Board of Editors from 1974 to 1995. He also served as the editor of the Britannica's Gateway to Great Books in 1963. So this man knew his stuff. You may have grown up with a multi-volume encyclopedia in your home. I did. My parents had a 1974 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. They got rid of it almost 20 years ago after asking me if I wanted it. I declined, saying that I didn't have enough floor space. If I had one of those mechanical kicking machines that you used to see on cartoons, I'd be using it right now for your viewing pleasure on myself. I cannot believe I let an opportunity like that slip me by, but I digress. I'm going to skip a lot of their fascinating history of encyclopedias and their uses and try to make this relevant to readers today. They say the primary reason people use encyclopedias is just to find facts. Facts like the date on which Abraham Lincoln was born. So I'm going to stop right here and point out that not all sources of information are created equal. You can find facts online, and you need to be very careful about where you're sourcing them. I used to tell my students to beware of Wikipedia. It's my understanding that Wikipedia has taken great strides towards writing information they present these days and making sure that it's accurate, and that's great. But any source, any encyclopedia, can and does contain errors. I'll also point out that the Encyclopedia Britannica has a free encyclopedia online now. It's excellent. The information in it is greatly abbreviated from what they have behind a paywall because stuff isn't researched and written by itself yet. Experts and good information don't come cheap. But I must acknowledge that this is a fluid and ever-changing landscape. The point is, sometimes facts aren't what they seem. And they make this point too. When I was a librarian, kids would occasionally either bring me a couple of books, reference or not, and raise their hand and have me come look at their computer desktop. In these cases, they found contradictory information. For example, the birth date of a person would be different in two different sources. Of course, I would instruct them to check a third source, a reliable source, and go with the date that's mentioned twice. Another point they make is that opinions are not facts. This has always been a problem, and it's worse today when everyone considers themselves an expert and has access to get their opinions about things out there. Facts can be externally verified. Just because something is written in a book or on the internet doesn't make it true. Good encyclopedias will always give existing points of view and theories. They do not endorse one over the other unless the facts back them up. The source will make all of this plain. If the source isn't open about contradictory evidence to the theory they're presenting, it's dishonest and shouldn't be relied upon. Another point is that theories can be proved or disproved. So an encyclopedia written in 1974 will be of some use for some facts, but not for others. Old encyclopedias can be useful to illustrate past thought on these matters, but more recent information needs to be consulted to make sure that the old information hasn't been superseded. And finally, I was happy to see this in their book. Facts are, to some extent, culturally determined. They point out that what we would snidely refer to as a primitive culture may have differing facts about plants and animals around them than we do. That doesn't mean they're wrong. They may, in fact, be correct where we're mistaken, and vice versa. Sometimes two opposite things can be true at the same time. We all know that. It's called a paradox. They say you need to be careful about arrogantly imposing your facts on other cultures. Good advice. And that's where they end the chapter. Remember those points, and you should be able to use outside sources to good effect. Whew. That was a lot of information. I didn't get into the internet and reference sources and more current aids to reading because you could easily write a book or teach a course on that. But I hope Adler and Van Doren's discussion has got you thinking. A lot of what they say still applies. My next video in this series will be the next chapter of the book, where we begin Part 3, Approaches to Different Kinds of Reading Matter. We will cover Chapter 13, How to Read Practical Books. So until next time, happy reading.